Good morning, everybody, and welcome to today's webinar. We're doing, in fact, this webinar for the second time. Webinar will talk about the Harmonized European standards and drafting the standards compliant with EU legislation. My name is Els, and I will be moderating the webinar in the background. As usual, you will be muted during the presentation, so please use the Q&A panel to submit your questions. There is no possibility to unmute yourself. We kindly advise you to use the Q&A. As much as possible, the speakers will have a look at the questions and will reply your question right away during the session. If your question remains unreplied, please note that we intend to create a Q&A report later on that we'll make available for you as well. We will also share with you the presentation that we're using today, as well as the recording to the full webinar. So without further ado, let me introduce you our Director Standardization and Digital Solutions, Mrs. Cinzia Missiroli, who will welcome you to this webinar. So please, Cinzia, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Els, and good morning, everyone. It's a sunny day in Brussels, and I hope that is the same wherever you are in Europe, and that you are ready to follow a 2.5-hour webinar dense of very useful information. So that we hope that you can find it useful and you can submit questions throughout the webinars to the different speakers that are there to respond in live, or to, as was mentioning, also all the question and answer will be provided after the webinar to all of you, because I think that the question and answer part is also very useful for all the technical body officers. As you know, the standards that are intended to offer presumption of conformity to European legislation is one of the key activities of SEN and SENELEC. A lot of efforts and resources are being put in place in order to give you the required support to produce the relevant standards. As you know, things have evolved in the last couple of years, and a series of measures are being put in place, and you will see more in detail through the different presentations that you will receive this morning. I would like to highlight, though, that today's presentation is one of horizontal nature, that is not sector specific. So we will receive sector-specific trainings later on during the year, but this is a baseline with guidance that is applicable to all sectors. So if you have sector-specific question, please don't hesitate to contact directly your relevant project managers. But again, this one is intended to be a horizontal one. My team will spend this 2.5 hours with you. As I mentioned, I think it's a really dense webinar with full of information. Don't hesitate to submit your question and take full advantage of it. We have been making quite a good progress in terms of citation, but we know that there is still some work to do in order to make sure that all the standards that we offer can be accepted by the European Commission for citation. And this is one of the tools that we offer you in order to make sure that this happens. I think that without further ado, I leave the floor to the first speaker. I wish you a really good webinar. You see here the content of the presentations. We go from the more generic one on the new approach, the legislative framework, throughout the different aspects related to the HAS assessment system, the drafting of the standards, and also in relation to our international counterparts, ISO and IEC. So this, as well as I mentioned, will be clearly elaborated throughout the webinar this morning. So again, I wish you a fruitful webinar. I hope that you find it very useful, and I leave you to the first speakers. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Cinzia. Yes, let's go right away into the presentations, because there is, as you say, a lot of things to see and to do or to talk about. Let me ask, please, Catherine, to share your screen, because Catherine will talk about the new approach, the new legislative framework, and the standardization request. So please, Catherine, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Ez. Good morning, all. I hope you can see my screen. So yeah, the idea of this first presentation is to briefly present you the frame in which CEN and CENELEC are developing standards in support of European legislation. And to start with, let's just give you an overview of the EU product harmonization legislation and how we arrived to the current legal framework. So in the past, more than 30 years ago, the old approach to European technical legislation implied that the detailed technical requirements were defined in the legislation, which concretely means that, in fact, national authorities draw up technical legislation. And this kind of legislation did not prevent any barriers to trade within the different European countries. And in 1985, the Council resolution of May 1985 on a new approach to technical harmonization and standards opened the door to the elimination of those barriers to trade for the different types of products, and this through technical harmonization. So the directive following this format were and are still commonly known as new approach directives. And these directives are based on a total harmonization since they replace, in fact, the diverging national legislation. It is important to know that this new approach deals with large families of products, from machinery to construction product to toys to healthcare, etc., but also with what we call horizontal risks, such as, for instance, electromagnetic compatibility. And yeah, as such, the new approach is used as a method of harmonization for most of the industrial products known in Europe. What are those principles? What are the principles of the new approach? In fact, the new approach directive defines essential requirements, health and safety requirements. And these essential requirements are the requirements that products must meet when put on the market, or must meet in order to be put on the market. So these requirements are mandatory. And in fact, these essential requirements indicate the desired outcome without really specifying how these requirements need to be achieved. So in fact, they define the result to be attained or the risk to be dealt with. And essential requirements in those legislation are then written in such a way that they remain valid over the time and that they do not become obsolete when there is any technical progress. And then the link with the standards. In fact, this new approach directive foresees that CEN and CENELEC, following a standardization request, and we will come back on this a bit later in this presentation. So CEN and CENELEC, following a standardization request given by the European Commission, then to CEN and CENELEC, develop European standards or identify already existing standards, which offer, in fact, the technical solution to meet these essential requirements set in the legislation. And these standards, which meet these essential requirements, are called harmonized standards and gives presumption of conformity to these essential requirements when used, when the standards are used. In addition to that, products manufacturing compliance with those harmonized standards benefit from, as said, from a presumption of conformity and a CE marking as well. Then if I jump to my next slide, 10 years ago, yeah, already 11 years ago already, in order to improve the European Union product harmonization legislation, but to improve it in terms of coherence, let's say definition, alignment of definition, alignment of some legal principle, the new legislative framework was established. It does not change, I mean, this new legislative framework does not change the new approach principle as such, no. It's just to further improve, let's say, some horizontal aspect. And this new legislative framework consists in 3 pieces of legislation, but the most important one is put here on the slide. So We still often speak about new approach directive, new approach system, but we sometimes mix also new legal framework. Somehow the new legal framework is somehow the extension of the new approach with some improvement, let's say horizontal improvement. If I go to the next slide, this is a visual just explaining also another way to explain the link between the legislation and the standard. So the legislation is on top and it's mandatory. It's set by public authority, in our case, by the European Commission, European Council, Parliament. These are mandatory. And then we do have standards developed by CEN-CENELEC and ETSI, which are the European Standards Organization as defined by another EU regulation, the regulation 2025/2012, which also says that standards, even if referred to in the official journal, remain voluntary. And this is very, very important to remind, even if listed in the official journal, or even if standards are prepared in support of legislation, they remain voluntary. As already said, the new approach, the new legal framework regulates a lot of very important industrial sectors. I've already mentioned this to you a few slides ago, but you have the list, and this is really not exhaustive. We have many, many more. It is very important to remind, or very important to know, that when European standards are developed in support of new approach directive, new legislative framework, they have some specificities. In fact, there are some things different from a normal European standards. For instance, they have pages, specific pages or aspects that other standards do not have, and which needs to be taken into consideration. For instance, standards in support of legislation needs to be assessed. The compliance with the legal requirements needs to be assessed. I will not go into the details now because my colleagues will give you a little bit more info later on, but this is important to keep in mind. Another important aspect is that those standards in support of legislation do need to have, or have to have an annex Z, ZA for CEN, ZZ for CENELEC, making the link between the essential requirements of the directive regulation and the clauses of the standards. So here again, my colleagues will go through it later on, but this is also a key aspect that needs to be taken into consideration. Another point, it's only when cited in the official journal of the European Union that European standards give presumption of conformity to the essential requirements covered in the standards. This is also very important, not before, only when cited. And as I said just some minutes ago, the application of harmonized standards remain voluntary, and there are other means to show conformity to the essential requirements of a directive or a regulation if the manufacturer wish to do so. If I'm going to the next slide, which is already the second part of my presentation, I would like to make a point on standardization request. And the standardization requests are somehow the link between the legal framework and the CEN and CENELEC standards in support of a legislation. And why I do wish to mention this already now to you, it's because this is where you, dear technical committee officer, you start where we already need you, where you already are involved somehow. So, a standardization request, what is this? It is a request, let's say a political request from the European Commission to CEN and or to CENELEC to develop and adopt European standards in support of European policies and or legislation. This standardization request is an official implementing decision from the European Commission. So it's a legal act somehow. So we need already to take this into consideration. So this is the request. Then in very brief, and I will only focus on the top part of the slides, this is the process. A standardization request is drafted. It's sent to CEN and CENELEC. who can accept or reject the standardization request. If accepted, CEN and CENELEC develop the European standard in support of legislation. These standards are assessed. When published, these standards are offered to the European Commission for citation in the official journal. So this is the visual. But let's start from the beginning, from the top left of the slides. Where does that standardization request come from? Well, a standardization requests are first mentioned in the document that is called the Annual Union Work Programme for European Standardization. This is an annual document published by the European Commission. This document is available on internet. You can, if you type on internet, you'll find it very easily. And you'll also find those from the previous year. So this is an annual document identifying the strategic priorities in terms of standardization from the European Commission. And it is there that we, as CEN and CENELEC, can already find the first reference, or this is the first sparkle regarding a future standardization request. But at that stage, when mentioned in the European Union Annual Union Work Programme, it is not yet a standardization request. It is the first idea. We say, we already know that next year we might have a standardization request on such a topic. Then usually, and there again, I will not go into the details of the development process, but then the European Commission, let's say in the months after the publication of the Annual Union Work Programme, will come back to CEN and CENELEC with the first draft standardization request. And this is very important for you to know, because there already technical committees, experts have already a role to play in the development of the standardization request. So if I go to the next slide, as said, the development of a standardization request. I mean, there is a long theory in the document mentioned here, which is EC Vademecum, European Commission Vademecum, on European standardization, which is also available on the on internet. But to make, let's say, a summary, each standardization request is drafted first by the European Commission, but in consultation with the relevant stakeholders. Relevant stakeholders being CEN and CENELEC, of course. So when we received a draft standardization request, CEN and CENELEC usually, we always set up what we call a standardization request at the group, which has the nice acronym SCHRAG. This group, the secretariat of which is held by the CEN CENELEC Management Center, is in charge of coordinating the CEN and CENELEC position towards the standardization request. The position in terms of technical feasibility, very important, available expertise, time frame, and it is exactly in that group that CEN and CENELEC can prepare its position, but it is also at that stage that we can still influence the content of a standardization request. And this is a very important step. And that's why with colleagues, we thought that it would be already interesting for you to mention this standardization request and this standardization request at the group at that stage and in today's presentation. We need you, in fact, already at the very beginning of the development of a standardization request. If I go to the next slide, in terms of process, indeed, when finalized, when we have submitted, let's say, our comments, when the standardization request is finalized and voted, the standardization request is voted by the member states in a committee that is called the Committee on Standards. Then if voted, and if positively voted, the document, the standardization request is sent to CEN and CENELEC. Well, the implementing act is sent to CEN and CENELEC for acceptance of rejection. We have 1 month to reply. That's why sometimes we are a bit tough with our members when we receive an official standardization request. The clock starts ticking, so we need to go fast. A standardization request has an expiry date. And what is also very important already for you to know is that a standardization request is usually composed of 2 pages of, let's say, legal horizontal text. And then there is usually an annex with a list of standards that the Commission wants us to develop or wants us to revise. It is very important that that all the work items to be developed in support of a legislation is mentioned in this annex of a standardization request. If the work item or if the reference of the work item is not there, we'll never be able to offer that work item, that standard when finalized, to the European Commission for citation in the official journal. So it's very important that your work program is also in line with the annex of a standardization request. If and when there is any need, for instance, if there is some project missing in the annex of a standardization request, a standardization request can be revised. But this revision of a standardization request remains a full approval process. It's a full process for standardization requests. So it can take several months. That's the message. So standardization requests can be revised, but it takes a while. But feasible, possible, no problem. The Commission has mentioned that they will not open or that they will not revise standardization requests several times a year. No, it's an annual exercise. If there is a need, for instance, for big directives, big technical directives, they will revise the standardization request, of course, if we request it, if Sen and SEC request it, but on an annual basis and not every 3 months. You might be interested to know that the standardization request, all of them are available on a database, European Commission database, and you have the link here. Yeah, and this is my last slide, is just to show you, to present you the look and feel of a standardization request. So on the left-hand side, you have, let's say, the template of a standardization request, which is two pages document. And on the right-hand side, you have the annex where really the Commission is setting the standard they want to see revised or developed. As said, a standardization request is developed, so before finalization, is developed in conjunction, or let's say in cooperation with the relevant stakeholders, including Sen and Senelec. That's why, again, please attend or be part of our standardization request at the group so that you can influence and give your share your thoughts and give your opinions on the text of a standardization request. So we need you already well before the development of the standard. So I believe this is my last slide. Yes, it is. I thank you for your attention, and of course I remain available in the chat to reply to any question regarding the standardization request. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Catherine. I think a few questions came in already for you. So yes, please, if you can have a look.
Yep,
while
sure.
we continue the presentations. I see that Nuno is starting sharing his screen because he will give us an update on the HAS assessment system. Please, Nuno, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Els. As Els said, the aim of this session of this webinar is to give a recap, an update on the HAS assessment system, and also to give you some guidance on what should you do in case you receive a lack of compliance HAS assessment at formal vote stage, but more from a procedural point of view. So the HAS contractor is Ernst Young, who is managing the HAS assessment system. The contract between Ernst Young and the Commission started on the 1st of April 2018, and it will terminate on the 31st of March 2022. So this means that the Commission will have to launch a new tender for a new contract that in theory should start on the 1st of April 2022. And we are in close contact with the Commission to ensure that there shouldn't be interruptions of the HAS assessment system from the current contract until to the new contract. So this is something that is a message that we are passing to the Commission. Ernst Young is the formal contact point towards the Commission and the European standardization organizations, like Sen and Senelec. EY has 3 main tasks. The first one is administrative and logistical tasks to coordinate and allocate the work to the consultants. The second task is horizontal verifications and checks of non-technical nature. So every time we make the assessment, Ernst Young assessment request, Ernst Young will ensure that the assessment request was done correctly. They will also look at the work item to ensure that it's correctly linked with the legislation and with a standardization request or a mandate. And the third task is on the evaluation of the assessment results and the effectiveness of the assessment concept. So after, for example, a HAS assessment performs an assessment, Ernst Young will do some sort of quality check to ensure that everything was done from an horizontal point of view. The HAS contractor is managing the pool of HAS consultants. So this means that the HAS contractor is responsible for allocating a standard to be assessed to one consultant, and it's also the responsibility of the HAS contractor to allocate the consultant per sector and also per TC. So there is a standard allocation of consultants per TC, but of course a consultant will have some expertise in certain sector. The HAS consultant is an independent expert hired by Ernst Young to perform two main tasks. The first one is, of course, to assess harmonized standards against the standardization request and the EU regulation, like a directive or regulation. And the HAS consultant should spend 80% of their time on the assessment of standards. 20% of the time of the consultant should be allocated to communication with the technical body, so exchanges and interactions with the technical body in order to give some guidance, some advice, and to agree on a possible way forward to solve, for example, a lack of compliance HAS assessment. Now, you know that the Commission has decided to temporarily suspend meetings between the technical bodies and the HAS consultants because of some budget limitations of the HAS project. But the Commission has informed recently that additional funding was found to allocate to the HAS assessment system. And this means that meetings with the consultant will be possible again. Normally, the timeline that the Commission told us was in July, you can already be allowed to have a meeting with the consultant. But of course, once we have the confirmation from the Commission or Ernst Young, you will be immediately informed. One of the important messages is that after you receive a lack of compliance HAS assessment, it is very important that you organize a meeting with the consultant and exchange in order to agree on a way forward. So when can HAS assessments be requested? So there are 4 stages. The first working draft stage is optional, but highly recommended that you request this assessment because it's very important to receive the comments from the consultant at very early stage of the development of the standard. And these will also increase the chances of receiving a compliant assessment at inquiry stage, but more important at formal vote stage. Then we have the inquiry HAS assessment, which is mandatory. The formal vote is also mandatory HAS assessment. And then very exceptionally and in very limited cases, it's also possible to have a publication HAS assessment, for example, to make a final verification on the Annex Z. This should happen only, again, if you receive a lack of compliance HAS assessment at formal vote stage and after the closure of the formal vote. So remember that technical comments after the formal vote stage are not possible to be integrated in the standard anymore. Now, in terms of duration, once we make the request to Ernst Young for the HAS assessment, Ernst Young has 5 weeks to upload the HAS assessment report on the HAS platform on LiveLink. And one of the most important messages that I would like to share is also that it's only possible to have one HAS assessment per stage. So this is something that was decided by the Commission and Ernst Young. If you receive a lack of compliance at formal vote stage, if the TC decides to revise the standard, it's not possible, again, at formal vote stage to submit the revised document to a second formal vote HAS assessment. This slide is very interesting because it shows in a very graphic way the intervention of the HAS consultants during the development stages of the standard. Here we have elements of the flexible standards development process and the time frame that is allocated per the different stage, and you have the legend here in the bottom right of the slide. But of course, as I just mentioned, you have one assessment at first working draft stage. Then you have 2 mandatory assessments prior to inquiry and prior to formal vote. But at the end, once the standard is published, it is up to the Commission to decide after an assessment on whether the standard can be cited in the official journal or not. If the Commission decides to reject the citation of the standard, they always give us some comments, some reasons that we follow, that we send to the technical committees for then follow up on those comments. In terms of outcome of the Haas assessments, the outcome can be compliant, and this means that the standard can be cited in the official journal. Another possibility is lack of compliance, and this means that the standard cannot be cited in the official journal, and in the point of view of the consultant, there are some changes needed in the text of the standard in order to ensure compliance. Partial compliance was an option that was possible at the beginning of the Haas assessment system, but then the Commission decided to remove this possibility because it was not sure whether the standard would proceed to the next stage or not. So for clarity, the Commission decided to remove this option. The Haas assessment reports can be found on the CEN and CENELEC BOSS pages. I would advise that whenever you are drafting an harmonized standard, that you take a look at the Haas assessment template to have an idea on what are the aspects that the Haas consultant check when they are assessing the standards. If you receive a standard with a lack of compliance, for instance, it is very important that you go through each comment carefully, that you don't ignore any comment. I would also ask for you to pay particular attention to the item 1.2 of the Haas assessment report, which is about critical findings that are leading to a lack of compliance. Of course, all the comments are relevant, but I would ask that you pay particular attention to this one because are the critical findings. The Haas assessment reports can be found on the Haas platform live link. We have 2 main folders, one for CEN and one for CENELEC. Inside these folders, there are 2 subfolders, one called to be assessed, which is the folder that we use to request Haas assessments to Ernst Young. And then we have the folder assessment results, which is a folder that Ernst Young uses to upload the Haas assessment report when it is finalized by the consultant. And it's the folder, of course, that the TC Secretary and TCMC will use to download the Haas assessment report. It is also important that you set, that this message is maybe more for TC Secretaries, that you set a notification on the respective folder on LiveLink for the assessment results. So you are sure that you don't miss a Haas assessment report that is uploaded. So what you have to do is you go to the folder assessment result, which includes many folders per TC. What you need to do is to click on the arrow of the folder of the TC that you follow. Then you have a drop down with many options and you need to select the option set notification. Then you need to choose how often you would like to receive this notification. That could be hourly or midday or weekly. And then, of course, you need to repeat the same procedure for the other technical committees folders that you are following. In terms of procedure for requesting the first working draft Haas assessment, first, the TC Secretary needs to submit to CCMC the first working draft document. And in the transmission notice that is here on the right side of the screen, it is important that you mark that you wish to have the Haas assessment of the first working draft, which is marked in the red box below. Then the CCMC project manager will submit the request to Ernst Young. It is important that the first working draft already includes a first draft of the Annex Z. And for parallel work, remember that the equivalent of the first working draft is the committee draft document. And it is important that you liaise with ISO or IC in case of parallel work to ensure that the committee draft is also going to be submitted for the assessment of the consultant at this early stage. The assessment report will be obviously made available on the Haas platform live link. In case you receive a lack of compliance Haas assessment at first working draft stage level. Remember that even though it's very early in the stage of developing the standard, you can already request a meeting with the HAS consultant. Of course, when the meetings with the consultants are going to be possible again, which should happen very soon, as I just mentioned. In terms of process for requesting the inquiry HAS assessment, so now I will explain for homegrowns, and homegrown standards are standards that are developed by CEN Technical Committee or CENELEC Technical Committee without work in parallel with ISO and IC. So in those cases, the technical committee needs to submit the draft inquiry standard to CCMC that should include already an Annex Z, and it should include, you need to submit as well a checklist for harmonized standards. So this is a new element that we will cover in the next session of the webinar. So I'll come back to that later. Then the CCMC editor, after finishing editing, will request the inquiry HAS assessment at the same time that will request translation of the document, normally into German and French. And then the HAS assessment report will be made available on the platform. In case you receive a compliant HAS assessment at the inquiry stage, if all the criteria are met, this means that it is possible to skip the formal vote. And when I mean that the criteria must be met, it means that you need to receive a positive inquiry vote, which is a weighted vote. And remember that if you wish to skip formal vote, technical comments received at the inquiry stage cannot be taken into account. If you receive a lack of compliance HAS assessment, one of the aspects to take into account is that the launch of the inquiry is not delayed. So in other words, we will not stop the inquiry at this stage for the TC to solve the assessment. So the process will continue. And then after the inquiry closes, of course, you need to consider the comments received at the inquiry stage. You need to as well look at the comments from the HAS consultant, and then organize a meeting with the consultant in order to solve the issues and clarify the comments with the consultant. The procedure for requesting the formal vote HAS assessment is very, very similar as the inquiry process. The only difference is that what you need to request as well or submit as well is the inquiry HAS assessment report, where in the last column that is called observations of the Secretariat, you need to complete this column to indicate how the consultant comments have been addressed. And I have pasted on this slide an example from a technical committee that used this column to show to the consultant how the comments have been addressed by the TC. So once the assessment is available on the platform, it can be, of course, downloaded. If the assessment is compliant, this is good news. The formal vote can start. And then the standard will be, of course, published and offered to the Commission for citation. In case we receive a lack of compliance HAS assessment, we need to follow the procedure described in the BT decision about the HAS assessment system. And you have the reference of these BT decisions here on the slide. And the focus of these next slides will be more on homegrowns. And my colleague will give further information on the parallel work for this. So in case you receive a lack of compliance HAS assessment at formal vote stage, the first point is that the formal vote is suspended for a maximum period of 12 weeks after the reception of the HAS assessment. So in other words, this means that if we receive a lack of compliance at formal vote stage, the formal vote is not launched, is on hold, to give the opportunity to the technical bodies to look at the comments from the HAS consultant and then discuss them, of course, in the working group, and then agree on the way forward. The second point is that the technical body secretariat and the BT member or permanent delegate of the national standardization body or the national committee holding the secretariat shall be informed. And then the third point is that the technical body needs to decide within a period of 7 weeks what is the best way forward to solve the comments from the HAS consultant. In order to solve a lack of compliance HAS assessment, we recommend TCs to follow the procedure that is described here below on this slide. So the first point, which is not written, it's quite obvious that you need to discuss first the comments within the working group and then make a proposal on what is the best way forward. And then what you need to do is prepare 2 types of documents. The first document is the Haas assessment report with the last column that is called observations of the Secretariat completed to indicate how the TC is going to address the comments from the Haas consultant. So that's the first document. The second document is the revised draft in track changes showing the changes made by the technical committee in comparison with the formal vote draft version that received lack of compliance. So you need to prepare these two documents. Then the TC secretary should organize a meeting with the Haas consultant. And again, as I said, it's very important that you exchange with the consultant, that you organize meetings with the consultant in order to solve the assessment. Before the meeting takes place, the TC needs to provide to the consultant the documents that I just explained before. So the documents highlighted in these 1A and 1B, basically to prepare the consultant for the meeting and to show to the consultant how you are proposing to tackle his or her comments. Then after the meeting takes place, the TC records the outcome and asks the consultant whether his or her comments have been sufficiently addressed in the revised text of the harmonized standard. So this can be done at the end of the meeting, and if that's the case, that feedback needs to be recorded in the minutes of the meeting, but it could eventually as well happen after the meeting takes place via email, for example, to get this sort of feedback from the consultant. Following the outcome of the meeting or the interaction with the consultant, the TC needs to agree on what would be the best way forward. One of the options, which is the most ideal option, is that the TC decides to revise the draft standard to solve the lack of compliance Haas assessment. In this case, then the TC needs to submit the revised document to CCMC for formal vote, together with any supporting documents or justifications available and needed. And then we can consider the Haas assessment, or the TC considers that the Haas assessment has been resolved. Of course, CCMC is there to support you, and we will mark it in our internal database that the Haas assessment has been resolved. Then the process can continue. If the formal vote is positive, the standard is published, and then we will offer to the Commission for citation in the official journal. What is important to note is that we are offering something to the Commission that received lack of compliance formal vote Haas assessment. Because of the limitations of the system, as I explained, we are only allowed to have one Haas assessment per stage. We are offering something to the Commission with a lack of compliance. So it's very important to submit to the Commission desk officer for certain sector some supporting documentations from the TC to explain how the technical committee is addressing the comments of the consultant to solve the lack of compliance assessment. Another option after a meeting with the consultant on the way forward is that the TC concludes looking at the Haas assessment report and the feedback or the outcome of the meeting with the consultant that there are no changes required in the body of the standard. The only change needed is in the Annex Z. So in this case, what the TC needs to do is to work on the Annex Z. The TC secretary needs to submit the draft standard together with this revised Annex Z to CCMC for formal vote. If the formal vote is positive, it means that the standard is published, and then we can offer to the Commission. And then we are in exactly same situation as the scenario before, that we are offering something with the lack of compliance. So we need to show some evidence and documentation to the Commission to show that the TC has solved the lack of compliance Haas assessment. In this scenario, very exceptionally and in limited cases, for a final check on the Annex Z, as I just explained earlier, it would be possible to request a publication Haas assessment if the technical committee is not really sure if the Annex Z was correctly revised. But as I said earlier, remember that technical comments cannot be taken into account after the formal vote stage. So we need to use this option very carefully. If we receive a compliant Haas assessment, that's great news. The standard can be submitted to formal vote, can be published and then offered to the Commission for citation. If we receive a lack of compliance assessment, the TC needs to analyze. There is still the chance to make some changes in the Annex Z through a BT decision. So if the TC decides to revise the Annex Z, the BT can approve that modification of the Annex Z. But again, we need to provide evidence to the Commission that the issues with found by the House consultant has been solved. After a meeting with, this is another option, after the meeting with the consultant, the TC decides to temporarily de-harmonize the standard, basically because there were way too many comments from the House consultant that will imply significant changes in the structure or the content of the standard. And the TC concludes that it's not possible to harmonize for the time being. So the TC needs to take a decision to request the BT to remove the Annex Z and remove any link to the legislation. If the BT approves, the standard without the Annex Z can proceed to formal vote. And then CCMC is required to inform the EC desk officer that we are not going to offer that standard for citation anymore. And then at the earliest convenience of the technical committee, they can launch a ballot for a new work item to initiate the amendment or a revision to solve the lack of compliance. So in other words, to start the work again and to bring this time harmonization to the standard. Another possible outcome after a meeting with the consultant is that the TC decides to permanently de-harmonize the standard. So the procedure is very, very similar as the one before. We still need to inform the Commission in case the technical committee decides, and if the BT approves, decides to remove the link to the legislation, the Annex Z. But it is not foreseen, at least in the short period of time, that the TC will launch a new work item to initiate an amendment. And the last possibility after a meeting with the consultant is that the TC decides to abandon the work because, again, there were way too many comments from the House consultant, and the TC decides that it's not possible to progress the draft standard to formal vote. And in this case, the best way forward would be, for example, to request the BT to abandon the work. If the BT approves, the work is abandoned. Our colleagues from data service will make these changes in the database, and then the TC can initiate at any time an amendment or a revision to start to solve the lack of compliance and to work on an harmonized standard to be then later on published and offered to the Commission for citation. On a different topic now, just want to recap as a reminder, because if the technical committee receives a House assessment, a lack of compliance to which you disagree, it is possible to request a review of the assessment to Ernst Young. So the procedure is that the technical body needs to make the request to the CCMC project manager with a very good detailed justification, and then CCMC will submit this request to the House contractor, who has 3 weeks then to reply with a reviewed assessment. So this is rather exceptional, but if you have a very strong reason, we can proceed in this way. In terms of inquiry, there is not really a time frame to request the review of the assessment in case you disagree, but for the formal vote stage, if you receive a lack of compliance, such a review request must be done within 4 weeks from the moment when we received the House assessment report. And again, it needs to be very well justified. In case you wish to request meetings, again, when possible, the technical body, if they wish to have a face-to-face meeting or a virtual meeting that is more than 4 hours, you need to use a dedicated Ernst Young link. So basically you have it here, print screen on the right side is a survey that you need to fill to request a meeting. If the technical body wishes to have a meeting with a consultant that is less than 4 hours, the technical body can contact directly the House consultant. There are a number of practices that are not allowed by the House consultant because the Commission thinks that goes beyond their responsibilities and tasks. So the first one is that the technical committees cannot ask directly the House consultant for an assessment. So the formal requests for assessments need to be done via CCMC. Another point is that the House consultant cannot draft specific clauses of the standard, and it cannot, or she cannot, participate in consensus building activities within the technical committee. The House consultant needs to follow the instructions of the European Commission, so they cannot provide guidance or advice on EU regulation, directives or regulations that go that were not previously agreed with the European Commission, basically. And at last, you cannot meet the HAS consultant after a final verification assessment. So the pub HAS assessment, if you have one, it's not possible then to organize a meeting with the consultant. At that stage is way too late. To conclude my part of this webinar, these are basically the messages that I would like you to remember of this session. So the first one is that please remember to request as much as possible the first working draft HAS assessment. It's optional, it's not mandatory, but it's very important that you receive the comments from the HAS consultant as early as possible in the process of developing the standard. These will also increase your probability of getting a positive assessment at inquiry or formal vote stage. The second point is that please exchange as much as possible with the HAS consultants. We know there have been an interruption of these meetings with the consultants, but they will be possible again. So please organize meetings as much as possible with the consultants following lack of compliance assessments. Before those meetings take place, prepare the meetings well in order to have a very smooth and efficient meeting with the consultant. So remember to submit prior to the meeting the HAS assessment report with the TC remarks in the last column of this document, and the revised draft standard in track changes to indicate to the consultant how the TC is proposing to address his or her comments. And the last remark is that normally we should only offer to the Commission a standard that is compliant assessment for citation. However, as I just explained you, and due to the limitations of the system, we are only allowed to have one HAS assessment per stage. So in some exceptions, at formal vote stage, if you receive a lack of compliance HAS assessment, it is possible that you rework the standard. And if you show some evidence that the remarks of the consultant have been sufficiently addressed in the standard, then we would offer such standard to the Commission for citation, and we would provide all the documentation as well to support that step by the TC. So that was it from my side. Thank you very much, and I'm happy as well to reply to some questions that you may have later. Thank you.
Thank you, Nuno. Many questions came in already, but I do see that the colleagues are replying them on the spot, so that's good. I think we've planned now a few minutes break. So it's 10:23 on my computer. I suggest that we break until 10:30. Is that okay for everybody? I'll put up the slide again to have a break, and then at 10:30 we restart again with the presentation. So please stay with us for all the attendees. You do not have to disconnect. You can stay here, just mute. Well, you're muted already. We will mute ourselves as well. And then we come back at 10:30. So see you right away.